butter? Because peanut butter is like meat. Right?
Yes.
Why
It's
are
not
you a
meat.
vegetarian?
All right, we'll talk about it another time. So
My mom.
we're going to talk about germination now, and I know probably for you guys in elementary school, you grew seeds, maybe sunflower seeds or bean seeds or something. And so, what does this word mean? Germination. Ava?
When the seed goes from a seed to a plant.
Yeah, when a seed starts to grow. So you probably have seen in the grocery store, the hardware store in the springtime, they sell seeds in a big rack in a little paper envelope. You can buy some seeds. So those seeds, what they really are is like an embryo of a plant, but they're dormant. Okay? They're not going to grow inside of that little envelope. They need certain things in order to start that process. But the process of germination is a plant starting to grow from a seed. So a plant starting to grow from a seed, we say the seed is germinating. And a seed needs certain conditions for that. What are some of the things that are needed in order for a seed to start to germinate? Brandon?
Water.
Yeah, it needs water. Okay? That's one of the most important things, water. What happens is once the water soaks in to the seed, it starts to soften the outer layer, the seed coat, so that it can start to grow. Also, it activates enzymes, which starts to break down the starch, the food that's inside of that seed. So we need water. What else do we need? Brianna?
Light.
Not necessarily, because think about, where do most seeds start growing?
Soil.
Underground, right? In the soil. So they actually don't need light at the very beginning. Yeah? Yeah, and where is the food?
In the soil. Glucose.
Yeah, and it's stored where?
In the backwood.
It's in the seed. It's that starchy part of the seed. That's the food for the plant. It also needs oxygen. In order to start using up that energy stored in the seed, oxygen is required. And then the last thing that's needed is the correct temperature. Because would it be a good adaptation if seeds started growing right now? Outside? No.
Yes.
Those tiny little plants would freeze.
And they can't grow
So they respond to certain temperatures. And once the temperature reaches the proper level, then the seeds can start to germinate. And again, that's an adaptation that allows the seeds to grow at the proper time. So what happens when a seed germinates is shown here. Here we have like a bean seed, for example. What happens is first, once the seed starts to get wet, it softens up the seed coat. It starts to swell up as it soaks in water. Okay? And the seed coat breaks open a little bit. Okay. Then oxygen is able to get into the seed. It starts to break down that stored up starch so that the plant can start to use the energy that's stored inside of it. Once it starts using up, that's the energy that's going to be used to grow. So as it gets access to that energy, it starts to grow a root. And that's what you see here. This tiny little root starts coming out of the seed coat. Obviously, it grows downward into the soil. At the same time, okay, the stem starts extending upward as it grows, and it eventually pops out of the ground, and then the first leaves start to emerge. Okay? Once those leaves open up and emerge, then it can start to use sunlight for photosynthesis and start getting energy that way. But until that leaf is mature and ready to start photosynthesis, it's getting all the energy from those cotyledons inside of the seed. So that's how the plant starts to grow, how it starts to germinate. Any questions about germination? All right, the last thing we'll talk about today is a little bit about the reproduction of plants. We already talked about plants reproducing sexually through pollination and development of the fruit. But plants also can reproduce asexually. So we know asexual reproduction, the prefix A means without, because there's no combining of genetic material. The offspring we know are also identical to the parent. That asexual reproduction doesn't result in any variation. So if you ways that plants reproduce asexually, one is through these things called rhizomes. Rhizomes, one of the way grass plants spread and start to take up a bare spot of soil, is they send out these rhizomes. These rhizomes are like stems underground. And they kind of go horizontally underground. And then every once in a while they pop up a new plant. And leaves start to grow and it becomes its own plant. Here you see some grass in this picture. And the rhizome grows horizontally and then up pops these grass plants. Now, each of these are just clones of the original. They're exact copies. There's no variation here because there's only one parent involved. Another example that's very similar is how strawberries. Did anyone ever grow strawberries at your house? Okay. So you may know, like, they send out these shoots above the ground, and every once in a while when they touch down into the soil, they start to grow a brand new plant. And so the strawberry sort of sends out, okay, these shoots that reproduce into new strawberry plants. But they're identical to the original. This is asexual reproduction. There's no pollination involved in this type of reproduction. Those are called runners. Now humans, obviously, strawberries the example there. Humans use plants all the time to feed ourselves, grow things we like to eat. And so often humans will reproduce plants asexually so they can get characteristics that they want out of the plant. So the advantages of asexual reproduction of plants is, first, you only need one individual, and you can make identical copies. If you have some super delicious tomato plant, and you love the tomatoes from it, they're big and juicy and resistant to disease, well, maybe you want lots of those tomato plants. By asexual reproduction, you could get exact copies of that tomato plant. Plants reproduce faster this way as well. It doesn't require them to wait for pollination to happen, then the fruit to develop, then the seed to be dispersed, then for the seed to germinate and grow into an entire new plant. Asexual reproduction can happen more quickly. So that grass plant can send out these rhizomes and fill up an area of soil pretty quickly, much quicker than if it went through all the steps of sexual reproduction. The disadvantage is that the offspring are identical, there's no variation, so if there were some disease that affected that one plant, well, it would affect all of those identical plants. Or if the environmental conditions change, if there's very little variation, then those plants might not be able to respond and survive in those conditions. If you have a lot of variation, it's more likely that one plant might be able to survive. So the way that people do this, one way is through making cuttings of plants. I did this earlier this year. The plant died though. I took a basil leaf. Here's the dead plant. I took a basil leaf from my plant at home because it was starting to get cold, it was going to die. And I just put the stem of that leaf in some water, and it started to grow roots. Okay? And that would grow into an entirely new plant. I've made a cutting of it. If you take one of these geranium leaves, put it in some soil, it'll start to grow roots out of that leaf, and it'll grow into an entire new plant. But again, it just is a copy of this plant. It's reproducing asexually. So sometimes people want exact copies of a specific plant. They will make cuttings and start to grow them. Another interesting thing people can do, something called grafting. In grafting, people can take two different plant types and graft them together so they grow together. It's joining two different parts of a plant. And I'll show you a video in a minute, but what you do to make a grafted plant is you take the plant you want to graft the top of, and you sort of carve it into like a point. On the other plant that you're going to graft it onto, you make a slit, kind of push them together. You wrap it up usually with tape, or sometimes they seal it with wax. And these two plants start growing together and will become one plant. And so sometimes people take two different types of fruits, like peaches and plums. They take the two branches, they're called scions, and graft them onto one stem. And now, after it matures, after it heals, this plant is growing, but it has peaches on it and plums. Okay? You can make trees which have lemons and limes and oranges on one single tree.
Why won't they mix?
Because they're just, you've taken them a branch from each one, like this is two different types of apples. They grafted this, Granny Smith apple onto the stem, and they grafted this Red Delicious onto the same stem, and now they're both growing in one plant. Does anyone at your house, maybe in your landscaping, have one of those umbrella trees that grows like this high? It grows straight, and then the branches are like that. If you look real closely, those are usually produced by grafting. What they do is they take one type of landscape tree that has a very straight stem, and then they do this. Onto the top, they graft a different, I don't know what it is, a willow or whatever, and that has droopy branches. They graft it onto the top, so you have a straight sort of trunk of that tree. Then the grafted part grows those branches that all droop down and looks like an umbrella. If you go and look at that plant, if you look underneath the sort of umbrella part, you might see, because when this heals, it has like a bump around it where those trees were grafted onto each other. And you might be able to see it. Ava?
How many plants could you put together?
I'm going to show you a video. Some people have done up to 20, or this video is 40 types of fruit grafted onto one tree. This actually is from Syracuse, New York, so it's kind of an interesting example to learn about. So I'm going to show you this, and then we'll move on to talk about our lab in a minute.